Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast featuring real conversations with conscious objectors to the status quo. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
Hello, dear listener. I am so glad that you are tuning in to today's episode. We have birth workers and herbalists Andi Rose and Jaycee join us for a conversation all about radical, holistic healing under capitalism. Together, we talk about the healing nature of plants and herbs, the lack of informed consent in medicine, and being understandably upset with our current social conditions. As I was editing this podcast this week, I was thinking about my journey with my IUD attempts. I made 3 of them, and none of them ended up staying within my uterus in the right place and all dislodged. But what I think was really interesting as I look back on that is that I came to my doctors and said I was feeling pain, an abnormal amount of pain. And the doctor looked at me and said, that's pretty normal, and never checked it. The only reason why I found out that my first one had dislodged was when I was doing CAT scans working up for my autoimmune disease and getting that checked, that they noticed something was out of place. This was years later. So I had come to a doctor talking about this pain. They told me that I was, overreacting or just a normal amount of pain for someone with an IUD. And it was only years later that I found out through other things that it was actually in the wrong place the whole time. And again, I tried it a second time, and even that process, I really had to advocate for myself to say to the doctor that, hey, something is wrong and I need you to check this with an ultrasound now. And it just kills my heart that I had to advocate for myself for that for the doctors that looked at me and thought I was, overreacting the amount of pain that I have. It was hard to advocate for myself in that scenario and to demand to get an ultrasound to check these things. And both times I was right that they were in the wrong space. And I know not everyone feels comfortable advocating for themselves in the doctor's office, in these difficult conversations where there is an inherent power dynamic. And that breaks my heart because there are probably many people out there who have had similar experiences of not being listened to in terms of our healing and the medicine work that we go through in these systems. So I just want to say that, something we talked about in today's conversation is listening to your gut and listening to your intuition. And my gut knew that something was wrong. And even though other people said it was normal, I had to keep advocating for that. And I just want to share with you that your gut knows when there is something wrong, and to listen to that voice and to seek out other opinions and seek out opinions from different systems of thought. I talk about how we have broken up the body into so many different parts. And the reality is that many of these different healing practices have bits of truth and knowledge that need to be synthesized and brought together. And so it can be important to get other perspectives on healing and what can be good for your body. So just sharing a little bit of my own personal journey with this one, because I think that I'm not the only person who has experienced this out there. And so if you resonate with that, I see you in that journey and the work that we are doing to advocate for ourselves within these systems. I'm sending you all so much love, and I hope that you enjoy today's episode. And then there's 2 people here. Who is this other person? Hello.
This is Jaycee, my co-teacher for the class.
Hi, it's nice to meet you.
Hello. Nice to meet you too.
Very excited to get Yeah, surprise! It's a threesome. Let's do it. I'm down for that kind of surprise. That's a good day. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing good. I'm just started bleeding, so I'm
with you, right there with you just today too. I don't know what that is.
middle of the night.
Taking it slow.
Heat pack.
Oh,
you can't see it, but I got it.
Yes. Love that. Yes. Where are y'all located at?
I am in the southern interior of British Columbia in the West Kootenays.
Ooh,
Yeah.
cool.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm on the north end of Vancouver Island.
Cool. Okay, so do you work together virtually then?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
cool. So cool. How did y'all get connected?
I wrote a book about contraception. Like, we're both actually birth workers. So I wrote a book about, it's about a lot of things, but the main thing that its main sort of selling point is about teaching people to use herbs as birth control and like very early contraception. And I sent it out for people to read for feedback. And then Jaycee and I just ended up sending voice notes back and forth like forever.
Yes.
And I got some of your tincture as well. Like there's a few birth Facebook groups in BC, and yeah, I think it was on there that you posted you were looking for the readers and you had some stock of your Queen Anne's lace, and I wanted to have that on hand for my practice and for me. So
Yeah.
yeah, so neat. Honestly, it's been pretty
And
fun.
then we started talking like every day, and I think our values are very similar, but our practices are quite different. And so our class layers together really well, because in wanting to talk about the same topics, we bring very different things, but they flow really nicely together.
Yeah, I love that co-collaboration, bringing together to make something even better than probably you could have created by yourself.
Yeah. I think it's one of the biggest strengths of our class actually is
Cool.
our teamwork.
Yeah. Well, as someone who just found out that their IUD is displaced again, any advice that you might have for someone? I'm thinking about getting another one placed under sedation, but it's just like this journey of finding some sort of contraception that works is quite the journey.
Yeah, and if your body is just sort of shaped in a way that the IUD doesn't like to sit where it's placed, like, not to be overly fear-mongering or whatever, but that can be really dangerous, right? Because it can, in a worst case scenario, it can cause pretty intense damage to your uterus, right? So I can see why that would feel scary and uncomfortable, and also increases your chances of getting pregnant because you have this thing floating around. It's like, yeah. I think for the people who IUDs work for, they love them. And then for the people that they don't work for, there's a lot of stories of like, why is it like this?
Yeah. I know, because I wanted to go a non-hormonal route because the hormones just made me break out so badly. So I've just never wanted to go down any sort of hormone route. So I've done copper, and I had my first copper, and then it perforated, came out, tried another one, and now a year later they're saying it's not in the right place, so it's not effective anymore. And I'm like, fuck, you're telling me I got to do this again?
Sounds like your uterus is like, no, thank you.
No, I know, but I don't want to go on the pill, and I don't want to do the shot because all the hormones, and it's just like, condoms, but then you got risks there with those breaking. So I just wanted to have two methods, but like, damn, might just be all I'm left with these days.
Yeah, well, my journey is similar to yours. Like I was on hormonal birth control pills, the NuvaRing, like for how many years was that? Maybe 5 years. And then, I was having bad side effects from the hormones. I was actually getting like chronic yeast infections every month.
Oh my God.
And I didn't even put it together that those two things were related. It was a naturopath like mentioned, like potentially those could be related. And so I went off, they completely stopped, but same, I wanted to have a method.
Yeah.
I went with the copper IUD, and it just didn't feel good in my body either. And actually like kind of caused heavier bleeding for me, at least.
Damn.
And I haven't been on birth control ever since I got that taken out. No. Yeah, I started tracking my cycle and using the cervical mucus method and temperature and condoms, and it's working pretty well for me. So I honestly highly recommend it.
Really?
I'm so in tune with my body. Like I know when I'm ovulating. Like,
Right.
I just know. So I'm like, yeah, maybe not today, or use a backup method, but it's pretty powerful. And that's, something Andy and I talk about sometimes too.
Really?
We're
Wanna do
thinking
another
of
class
teaching
on.
another class actually on top of this mental health one that we teach. We're thinking of teaching herbs for the fertility continuum, so like inclusive of contraception, but also doing like conception and pregnancy and birth and postpartum and children and all this kind of stuff, because I think that's kind of our other shared wheelhouse, you know. But yeah, that's what we connected on originally. And I can send you a copy of my book.
Sure.
It's not quite totally finished. It's very close to being done.
Exciting.
But yeah, it's wild to me, like, because most of my doula work has been supporting people with contraception stuff. And, you know, we can only get pregnant for 24 hours out of every month. And the window is expanded by the fact that sperm can survive for 5 days. So like if we have sperm in our body, it can last that whole 5 days up until that 24 hours. But, you know, when the egg is released from the ovary and it's floating down that tube, there is a very small window of time, and it's not hard to track when that time is. And because we don't trust people to do that, and there are reasons why we don't, because a lot of us are really disconnected from our bodies, right? But yeah, then we end up putting people on. I was on hormonal birth control for over a decade, from when I was a young teen, until I was in my early 20s. And then I was a raging feminist and was really angry about the like unfair sort of burden that's placed on women and people with wombs. And then I was in queer relationships for a really long time. So I was just like, I just have queer birth control. I just don't have sperm. That's my way of not getting pregnant, right? Absolutely.
Yeah. I like the idea though of tracking your cycle and being connected to it, right? And having this like deeper connection to your body. The other half of me is like ridiculously busy and or using the word lazy in that sense. We're like, wow, like you're telling me I got to add another thing on top of it, but also like maybe there is this space where it's even more of a spiritual and like embodiment practice to be connected to that aspect of yourself.
Definitely.
Yes.
It was really powerful.
And I think honestly, it's easier to do than I wrote this whole book about this, but I don't think I've ever tracked my temperature. Like I tried to at one point, and the thermometer that I had didn't work properly. And I just was like, fuck this. Like you can literally just track it through, like for me, I can track it through cervical mucus and like my mood. And it's pretty accurate. Like I've definitely known every time that I was pregnant or potentially pregnant, like I knew before when my bleeding time was happening.
Damn.
So if you're a reasonably like self-aware person, like as long as you have a fairly straightforward cycle, some people's cycles are a little more tumultuous. Like our cycle is a reflection of a lot of different things in our life. So yeah, I mean, we have a very sort of funny Jaycee and I have this like, cause we're both birth workers and then we're both herbalists.
We're not experts, like giving you a protocol for what to do, like
for sure, but you both have lived experience with these things, and I think sometimes, you know, at least I can recap, you know, from the conversation I had with my doctor about it, right, who's from the medical model, you know, who kind of told me like condoms don't really work. So, and I'm like, you know, especially as someone who's poly, like that's part of my world is using that sort of condoms, like, you know, with multiple partners. And so like, I'm already doing that, but like even that push from that medical perspective of like, well, you should have another like medical way, you know, like there wasn't any sort of discussion in that conversation about like, well, yeah, you could track your periods and then be aware of it and kind of know and then work around that. Like that wasn't even part of the options that were presented to me in that conversation I just had about this, you know?
Yeah. The options are very limited that are presented. It's kind of like, here's number 1, number 2, number 3 in their book. I don't know how they, you know, I don't know who tells them what they should offer people, but it's often the same thing for everyone, right? So like no individuality or honoring the unique experience of individuals, and super limited. It's also like, I mean, what is the percentage of condoms? Like it's in the 90s, so I don't know if you could say they don't work.
I know, right? I looked it up afterwards.
I think it's the difference between like when it's used properly versus when it's used by normal people, right? And it's the same thing with fertility awareness or any method, right? Where fertility awareness,
birth control, yeah.
yeah, like with fertility awareness, if it's done properly, it's in the high 90s. But if it's not done properly, it's not.
Right. Absolutely. And I think, but that's the discussion of that. They don't talk about that either, right? And then have that space to say like, yeah, when it's used properly, it's actually very, very effective. And I think it's scary sometimes when these are the people that you're getting your information from, right? Because it's your trusted source, your doctor, and there's always such a push towards, I mean, I could even get into this about psychiatry, right? And like that whole space too, as someone that works in psychology, where there's always this push towards like, well, here's a drug that you could take, here's this, and that, right? Where rather than having the space to discuss maybe more like methods that don't include changing my body chemistry in some sort of way.
Part of the reason why it's desirable to people is because people want to have those conversations, and they want to have them in a way that is not ideologically rigid, where you're either talking to someone who's like, pharmaceuticals are bad, you should never be on pharmaceuticals because they're horrible for you, or talking to someone who are like, plants can't do anything, or it's dangerous for XYZ reason. Like, it's actually very rare to talk to someone, I think, who's able to be like, you know, I personally am on a pharmaceutical that I might be on for the rest of my life that works really well for me. It helps me sleep. It reduces my anxiety. It makes my dreams more vivid. It's a good fit for me. But I also use plants and mushrooms on a daily basis, and I would never want to go one without the other. And it's very difficult to find people who, first of all, have that experience, and second of all, like, feel confident to make suggestions for other people based on the questions that they have, right? Because a lot of people are so scared of liability, and that's what's happening with doctors a lot, right? Is they have a script of what to say, and the script is partially written by pharmaceutical companies, and some of what they offer is helpful, but it's got a limited scope, right? And it's not usually enough. Like, so many, we do consultations like together and separately, and so many of the consultations we do, we're talking to people and we're like, plants can maybe help you cope with stress slightly better, but the situation you're in is really hard. Pharmaceuticals or plants or mushrooms, it's not really going to matter if the circumstances of your life stay the way that they are.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, you know, for a while I was hoping that like these conversations could happen with a doctor, you know, in that setting. And I've kind of tried, you know, because I do have the knowledge and the communication skills. And I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm definitely not saying it's impossible. But like Andi was saying, there are other factors at play, right? Where your health and well-being isn't the only concern, like isn't the only, yeah, they have other things to think about, like their licensure and legality. And so, yeah, that's why this class has been really, really beautiful. Like for me as well, you know, it's been super healing and educational for myself as well, just to have a space to just have these conversations and ask people their experiences, you know, like what is your experience on, you know, this pharmaceutical versus this pharmaceutical? Like, it's so great to finally be talking about this.
Yeah.
So I love that we've kind of created a space for that to happen.
Right. Yeah. And I think part of the reality for why this is what it is because we've broken up like health into so many different pieces, right? We're like psychologist, I just do brain, I don't do any sort of, you know, pharmaceutical anything. But then you have the medical model, and then that's all pharmaceutical, and they might not be taking in the contextual factors of kind of like you were saying, Andi, like the different sort of situational things that are going on in terms of your world and other pieces. And we've just like broken up the healthcare system into so many like different parts, thinking they're all separate. And I think we're starting to realize there's even a mind-body connection, all these other pieces, plus alternative ways to find healing, right? Like plant medicine and other sorts of things, you know, and because we've separated it so much, so differently, like there's no center point to come and talk to people about these things.
Yes, it is all connected. Yes, mind, body, gut, environment, nervous system, vagus nerve, food, like all of it, you know, just
hormones, trauma, attachment, resilience, sleep, I think a lot of people have tried natural ways of doing something, and they're at the point where they're either on or considering a pharmaceutical because they need help. There are some pharmaceuticals that I think, particularly amongst the folks I know who have ADHD,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people that I know on ADHD meds are like, this has changed my life. Like I can sit and I can focus. And I feel that way. The pharmaceutical I'm on is not for ADHD. I was a chronic insomniac for like over a decade. And I'm a single mother, so I need to be able to go to sleep. Like I can't be awake till 4 a.m, you know?
Yeah.
Sometimes a person doesn't necessarily need an herb that helps them feel calm. Sometimes a person just needs to be nourished.
That's a huge piece, is starting with being well nourished.
Right.
Rested, well nourished. Yeah.
Yeah, all of these pieces are needed to come together to be able to like thrive. You can't, any sort of other machine that we would think about, like a car, you can't just like leave. Yeah, you can't just like leave.
Metaphor.
Right, leave it on empty and expect it to run. Like and a lot of the times that's what we're doing, especially if we're so busy and we're just running from one thing to the next and you're just eating something really quick and like you might not be getting all the nutrients and other pieces that you need to really be alive, and like how deep that can affect your mood. And yeah, to me it's really fascinating because there's just, I was on an SSRI for like 2.5 years and then recently came off it this July. So this is my first kind of run around trying to like, having been on one, now getting off and noticing the differences that I feel in my own experience. And then even like the research on it and just like this big reality that we don't know how those work at all. I think there's a lot of like presumption that we're like, yeah, we figured it out. We realized it's serotonin. We're just like really easy, like here's the drug for it. And then we've realized that serotonin doesn't have any connection to depression, / we don't know how these drugs are effective, / we also know that there was this recent study that came out in November that specifically said that mindfulness was as effective as SSRIs. And that was pretty radical for me to see, like, okay, we're talking about mindfulness being as effective as a pharmaceutical. Like, we really need to rethink these conversations about how often we're like, here you go, here's the drug. Like, is there a world where we could give mindfulness just as much of a like run for its money of like, here you go, here's your. And I think it depends on context of where people are at and how effective it is. Yeah. And like people also throw in like working out or moving your body as another one that's been as effective, and all these other pieces. It's hard to say.
Because you're right that we don't know how pharmaceuticals, especially things like SSRIs, really work. Mm-hmm. And we especially don't know about the interactions between things like I work a lot with psychedelics and psilocybin specifically. We also don't know how, like, what the interactions of these things are, but we're really walking through this experientially and from a place of our embodiment and our intuition. SSRIs do seem to be numbing to our emotional capacity. Mm-hmm. And there are moments in life when that's good. When we're like, we are feeling very afraid. We feel like everything is too much. We can't function. We can't, like, it's too much. And, then eventually we reach a point where we're like, we can't use the SSRI to numb selectively. We can't turn the volume up on how much we love our dog and turn the volume down on how stressed we are about school or our job or some other problem we're having. We just are numb to all of it. And then people are often walking through this journey of like, okay, I've had the load lightened long enough mm-hmm. that I actually feel isolated from my emotional experience, and I want to start walking back into that sense of feeling. Mm-hmm. And then the person is having to go through usually titrating off in some way, coping with withdrawal. And then if they're also adding psychedelics into the mix, psychedelics turn up our emotional sensitivity. And then, they do other things as well, but it's this whole sort of like dynamic flow of how we're moving through our sense of connecting to ourselves and the world. And these are really complex things. And we can't get into this in a 10-minute conversation with our GP, mm-hmm. both because they don't have the time and also because they're just not trained to hold all of that.
Right. Yeah, because they're usually focused on other sorts of things in terms of their expertise. And because psychedelics, specifically psilocybin, these other medicines, there's still so much limited research about it. And until it's legal, they're not going to talk about it. That's part of, the reality of that. So I am currently training at Sauna Healing Collective in Chicago, where we do ketamine assisted psychotherapy, since that's legal and we're able to do that in-house. I was talking to one of my supervisors in that space, and I feel like when I was asking him these questions about SSRIs and psilocybin, I'll have to do some research before I release the episode and make sure I have some studies or something to back what I'm talking about. But I feel like he was saying that, the way that SSRIs affect the brain in terms of the different types of serotonin receptors, if we have, he was saying a 1A, 2A, these different types of receptors in the brain. So even that sort of way that they might be acting in different ways, but kind of like you said, Andi, the serotonin with an SSRI is going to numb down the expression so that it's actually less, there's less of a range of a window of emotions in terms of happiness and sadness, right? It kind of narrows it to calm, where, a psilocybin, these psychedelics do almost the exact opposite, where it amplifies all sorts of emotions. So then, you're coming into this interesting mix of something that can dampen and amplify, and trying to find that in between there, or the helpfulness of that sort of beauty that is plant medicine. I think these are really tough conversations for a lot of people, that one, because of the legality of it, who do you go to talk about this? And again, like you're saying, a lot of people don't necessarily have expertise in this like we do to be able to have that sort of conversation.
A really good resource is the Spirit Pharmacist. I think he's called Spirit Pharmacist on
Dr. Ben Malcolm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He has a PhD in
Pharmacology.
It's psychiatric pharmacology.
Psychopharmacology.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then he is doing all this work with people integrating psychedelics with psychiatric pharmaceuticals. And he actually, I think the best thing about his mailing list is that every month he sends out a roundup of new research and he summarizes it. I consider myself a pop science nerd. I can't really do the deep true science. My brain just doesn't really work that way.
Yeah.
But I can read, sort of the abstract, the summary.
Right. For sure.
No, I love research.
Yeah. And it's scary as someone who's supposed to be trained in how to read that, because that's part of my training is even the amount of bias that is in all of these sorts of things is fascinating. How people define variables, who they let in a sample size, even when you get into the statistical analysis and very things that they're running to be able to process that, at the end of the day, you kind of get to decide who falls in or outside of your data group. Even when I was going through training in school, they'd be yeah, that's kind of an outlier, we can just let those people go out of the data and leave it, and you're just because you do so many, you do hundreds of people, so you get these random outliers, but the reality is also so much of that then is being manipulated by what's your variable, how you define it, and all these other pieces that it's almost exhausting, to be clear, even as someone who's trained in how to read these things, to be able to read them, because there's just so many pieces. And it's so scary to me how I can see research and then people will interpret it and then write a summary, and then it just goes in the complete different direction from what the study was actually saying. And I'm just holy fuck, so the news and media, any sort of creative title that we can throw out there to be this is that, people just kind of do that in this world, and it's so scary to me.
Yeah.
I really love one of the things that's kind of cool about working with psychedelics specifically is I also come from a harm reduction festival background.
Yeah.
Where I used to do wandering and information harm reduction for people. And so a lot of my knowledge comes from the sort of Arrowhead vault, which is if people don't know what Arrowhead is, it's people using different substances and then self-reporting their experiences. And if you go, and it's a very cool kind of DIY rogue type of science, right? And I think that it makes room for what you're talking about, these outlying people to express what has happened to them. And sort of the value of that I draw from that is that we can use our bodies and our own experience to map these things, we can. And I think Jaycee has taught me a lot actually about St. John's wort, which is a major antidepressant herb, although Jaycee would say that's not actually what I think it's good for. know, these things of mapping our like experiences in these plants and these mushrooms that have these certain kinds of reputations, when actually they're much more complex beings than this. They have a much more complex way of existing in the world and in our bodies. And you're right that the science, you know, it lends an air of legitimacy, but it's not necessarily like all the whole truth, right?
Yeah. You know, we both, one thing that's really neat is both of us coming from our different practices, we kind of do this in a similar way. Is when someone is coming to us and they're wanting to work with a plant, we really encourage people to, you know, everyone asks like, well, how much do I take and how often? And we both encourage people like, you know, it's up to you. Try 5 drops, see how it feels. Try 10 drops, try 1 drop, you know, really tune in to your experience. And some people are like, oh, like they just so resistant to that. Like they don't have that relationship yet. They don't
crave instruction.
And so I guess that comes first, right? Is that self-knowledge and tuning into our bodies to be able to move forward in a relational way.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I mean, knowing knowledge through research is like one way to do it, and to assume that that's the only way is a very like colonial patriarchal hierarchy of like, this is the only way we know knowledge, versus other ways that society, humans have known knowledge, which is through direct lived experience with all these different relationships, especially when it comes to something that currently is still illegal, right? So being able to have conversations and know other people that do it, yeah, is a big piece of this. And yeah, I definitely get people asking about dosing too. And it's an interesting topic, I think, because like part of like the philosophy where I train is always like inner healing wisdom and being able to have a felt sense of where to go and to explore that. But it's also so tricky because like depending on what sort of information you've read on the internet, someone might say 1 gram is a psychedelic experience, and to someone else they might say you should go and have 5, you know, and like that those are really big differences. And so being able to like have like an informed consent about kind of knowing almost like, hey, you know, like this is kind of where this might go. I mean, we don't even know with your metabolism, your body, the actual substance you're getting, but this is also where this might go, and you're going to ultimately get to decide, you know, but like here's the informed consent of like what this might do, what this might do, and what this might do. Because like I think we're just missing that conversation of informed consent about these when we're looking on Reddit or other sorts of places to like find out how to do this, you know?
No, I feel similar. I just read a like a psychedelic guiding manual. Someone sent it to me and asked me to read it because they wanted my opinion on it. And I found it really wild that they were advising people to take a 4 or 5 gram dose, which on the one hand is like, sure, you can do that. But on the other hand, I'm definitely very much in camp. Like, and again, I learned this from Festival Harm Reduction. It's like you start low and you build on it, right? Like you don't necessarily want, and of course, in my younger years, I did some heroic doses of things that weren't measured, and who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows what was going on?
I'm
right?
alive.
Yeah, because I mean, most people who work harm reduction, we come to it through having had some experiences where we needed some help. And then, you know, we learned the humility and the ability to be with people, which again, like I think is similar to the birth work sort of aspect, right? Of even this book I was reading was talking about this, about how like if you're sitting with someone as a psychedelic guide, you're like a midwife to the spirit, you know, and there are these sort of beautiful, intuitive, energetic aspects of working with plants. And I would argue also working with pharmaceuticals to a certain degree, because everything is ultimately derived from the earth in one way or another.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it is also nice to, you know, like one of the things that Jaycee has really taught me is I've worked with St. John's wort in various ways and always not been super happy with the results for different reasons. Either I didn't get the color in the oil that I wanted, or I would take it and it would increase my anxiety or make me feel a bit manic. And, you know, Jaycee just taught me so many details, like, for example, working with like the fresh plant as opposed to the dry, and how much the research about St. John's wort is on the dried plant and focusing really specifically on this one part of the plant, the hypericum, you know, and it's like, when you start to understand all of these little detailed pieces, it's like, you know, on the one hand, going with intuition is a beautiful way to do it. But on the other hand, it's also helpful to talk to a nerd sometimes.
Yeah.
We don't all have to figure it out on our own.
Yes. Yes.
Most of us don't have hundreds of hours of research about a plant under our belt, right?
Right. Exactly.
Crowdsource and citizen science.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that way that you can kind of have a little bit more sense of just what you're getting yourself into. You know, I think the future landscape of this is going to change a lot in the next 10, 20, 30 years of having conversations like this. And I think it's scary to think we will hope, right, that the legalization of psilocybin for mental health and other sorts of recreational spiritual you know what I mean, use doesn't go down just into a medical model where it's completely controlled by people who have a doctorate in medicine, right? Which I could see that world creeping in. There's people like Compass that are paying to like have control over the therapeutic use of psilocybin in certain ways, and we just hope that that's not where it goes, right? That's not the history of this sort of plant medicine. It's never been medicalized like that. It's been an indigenous practice that's been around for centuries, right? So we're just, I think, at a very critical time to see, like, as it's starting to become legal and the research is coming out through the medical model, which is what like controls, the laws around drugs and other sorts of things, and the politics. Like, we're at a very critical time, I think, in seeing like where this goes and who has power over it. Scary.
Well, legalization is a tricky thing. Like, I mean, both Jaycee and I are Canadian, right? And so in Canada, the legalization of marijuana has been really odd to watch, because on the one hand, it's great that it's legal now, but on the other hand, when we were in the sort of gray zone with marijuana, which is, I think, sort of similar to where we're at now, where there are some ways it's sort of functionally decriminalized, or like less criminalized than it's been in the past. There's a lot of room to kind of experiment and play and do different things. But, when we get into the place where we legalize it, we also are criminalizing it in different ways. Like in Canada, we're only allowed to grow 4 marijuana plants per household. So even if you have, a giant collective house with 10 people or an intergenerational home, you can't have 40 plants because you have 10 people.
Right.
You can only have those 4 plants. And if you read the actual law, like how you're supposed to dispose of any additional plants, it's just bizarre. Like, you're supposed to I think you're supposed to chop up the plant and add cat litter to it or something, so it's totally destroyed, It's very odd. Like, the whole, and I mean, both Jaycee and I both we work within this kind of wise woman tradition, which is like laid out by herbalists like Susan Weed, but it's much older and longer than that, right? It's like knowing that it belongs to us and it belongs to our ancestors, and that we belong to the earth, and that we're in this conversation, ongoing way of living with all the beings around us, and it's so strange to be kind of prescribing and conscripting that inside of the medical model and the legal system. But we need those things to change for it to be more accessible to more people.
There's that fear of losing it, the people's medicine, right? Like having to rely on someone with whatever XYZ certification, what do you call it, permits, all that. There is a disconnect there.
Licensure and the limits of licensure. Like, we see that obviously a lot in birth work, right? Where it's like you see sort of midwives in Canada, because we have our universal healthcare system, and it's great, and there's a lot of good things about it, but our midwives that are covered by that system are so heavily steeped in liability and the structure of their licensure that they are doing things on a regular basis that are violating women and violating the people who are giving life to our children. And they don't even necessarily see it that way, because they are like, I have to do this to maintain my position of power and authority, and it's like, I think both of us are trained in a way that we believe that the authority has to rest in the person who is giving birth. And I think that, yeah, there are so many parallels between just learning to take responsibility for our own health and our own autonomy as healing beings. You know, it's a very different model to be fully responsible for yourself and your choices, not have someone or something else to blame. And I do think it makes people slow down and become a bit more creative. And we want to facilitate people feeling more comfortable to experiment and to play and to have trust with creative options.
And to know that they have choice and that ultimately it's their choice, you know, whatever option or direction they decide to go. Like there's no right or wrong, there's no stigma, you know, just to know that we have choices and really only we know the depth of our experience. And yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I think even as someone who is getting to a point where I will get a license, right? There's even fear for me in this level of conversation of like, I have to be careful about what's said on the podcast and what's said here versus there, because like it could risk my ability to practice one day and all these other pieces that like it does. Because of that reality, it's just like so much almost like blocking of maybe what I would say to a friend or other sorts of pieces, because there is that fear then of like, oh, well, this is, you know, it has a different meaning because of your doctorate or whatever, and all these sorts of things. And so it's such a scary space to be in terms of like honoring that power that's there to be able to work under the thing that I've trained under versus also being able to speak. And I think for me, like one way always around that is to put out a podcast in a way that's not professional in that, right? This is my personal life. I'm talking about my personal experience with psychedelics, which has been very healing for me, right? Like I can talk about it in that way instead of being like, this is what you should do, dear listener. It's like, here's my experience, and you can't really fault me for talking about my own experience in this, right? But like, yeah, like you said, playing in the game, in the system, with a licensure, it really does restrict you in a lot of ways. Yeah.
But we need all of those parts and pieces, right? Like,
right.
And I think that we need people who are inside the system speaking these things.
Yeah, for sure. It's crazy though to have a license to be able to do therapy means that like I'm gonna prescribe or medicalize people and diagnose them with something, and that's almost what it is, right? It's like any sort of therapy I don't get to get out of this like whole game where I have to like give someone a diagnosis, which I don't necessarily believe in, because I believe in larger like systemic factors that are going on, the relational factors that are going on, the nutrition, all these other pieces that are totally, it's not about the person as much as it is about the context, the generational trauma, the other sorts of things. So like that model doesn't even make sense to me, but like this is kind of the world we live in, where a lot of people won't have access to therapy otherwise. How am I going to get out of that model? I do want to create a nonprofit where I can do sliding scale, where we don't have to use therapy or insurance at all. Like these are all pieces of how I'm trying to get out of that model, I think, but it's a whole different world. So like, you know, one step at a time, trying to dismantle the patriarchal field of psychology. But I think part of like training at a place where I am, you know, talking about psychedelic experiences and helping other clients through that experience, part of also what I do want to offer is like a whole space of using psychedelics for creativity. Like there's so much of this push of like, here's psychedelics to like heal mental health. It's like, yes, it can do that. And there's also more to it. What if you want to have a creative practice, you know, where you personally, again, this is where I will talk about my personal experience. I like to have a psychedelic experience, bring out all of my coloring supplies, paint, art, writing, and just have like a full creative day, which is a part of my spiritual practice, right? Of just dipping into that and letting that flow. And I just don't think there's enough conversation about stuff like that.
I love that, because that's what often, you know, whether it's the pharmaceutical industry or the supplement industry, like they pigeonhole plants, right? That's what happens. St. John's wort is it's good for depression. And now hearing you say is like, that's kind of what is happening with psychedelics and psilocybin. It's good for mental health. But there are all these other aspects. You know, I was just listening to a podcast of using ketamine for sex therapy. Like, heck yeah, you know, like there's all these avenues. The plants are so multifaceted, and but that's just how our human brains like to work. Categorize and
well, and the licensure piece, right? So like you can't start to use ketamine for something that's not been research approved to be used for, right? Like, oh, but then it comes into again like the patriarchal model of sort of evidence-based practice, which is what, the field of psychology, medicine is all based on versus the field of time-tested medicine, right? Like people have been using these things for centuries, and when do we listen to that sort of experience and truth in time versus like a certain model of knowing truth in terms of like research evidence-based blah practice? And it's like, I think like how can we hold the nuance of both, of honoring it, but then again comes back to that licensure question where it's like, well, now I can't talk about it because it hasn't been used for that, so I can't really, so we just kind of like get ourselves into a bind of being able to talk about these things, which is so sad because at the core of it is healing and people's healing, and that's what should be more important, right, than like my licensure. But again, systems above us, it all kind of keeps us clamped in this way.
I mean, I think one of the things that Jaycee and I really both share as a value in our herbalism practice is that we sort of see plants and fungi in a way that is similar to people, in the sense that they have a personhood, they have a consciousness, they have a personality, they have a wisdom that they carry, and they're more complex than these single actions that we assign to them.
There's an energetic resonance as well.
And that's how you can work with these things in really, really small doses and have
profound impacts,
deep impacts from it.
Yeah, to be able to know that and have that sort of relationship then with the power of each of these different plant substances. And I think it's funny because people are always like, oh, but it's drugs, like I don't have drugs, like and it's always funny to me that like in our society every single day people wake up and take a plant medicine, a plant drug, and it's coffee, and people are just like, yeah, that's totally normal because I drink that every single day. And I'm like, you remember that's a psychotropic substance that will change your psychology and how you're perceiving the world. And everyone's like, yeah, but that's just what I do. It's just funny to me, especially in the field of psychology, when I'm working with other like psychologists and talking about it, and they'll be like, oh yeah, this person was smoking cannabis or like wanting to take these other things as they're buying a cup of coffee. And I'm like, do you understand the judgment that you're having towards someone who takes a cannabis gummy every single night to sleep as you get a coffee to wake up? Do you understand?
Take your pharmaceutical drugs.
Yeah. And they're like, yeah, but they're taking drugs every night. And I'm like, you're taking drugs every morning. What the fuck? Like, how do you not see this? Like, what?
Well, and so much of that is driven, like, I mean, I remember being in university and then also like working harm reduction at the same time and seeing over and over again this framework of like the way that we see drug use is very much mapped across different types of privilege, right? So it's like if you're drinking a $7 coffee from Starbucks and then when you get stressed out, you take a benzodiazepine from your like that you have as a prescription, right? And you're using all these substances, you're most likely, you can map that person's kind of social location from the different substances that they use, right? Whereas somebody, like I did a project at one point talking to people who lived in this very large park in Vancouver, and a lot of them are using meth. And I remember talking to this one guy and he's like, yeah, meth is great. It lets me not worry about if I'm cold, and it lets me like do stuff in the rain when I'm feeling uncomfortable. And he's because for him, he doesn't have $7 to buy a Starbucks coffee, and it's not going to help him do what meth lets him do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just social experience is so different, right? And I think, with working with plants and with fungi, the more I come to realize that it's like we are in a bit of a fringe sort of social group, but I definitely see more and more what I would consider to be, quote, regular people being like, but I'm interested in this. And I don't know who to talk to because my friends, my family, they think it's kooky and bizarre and out there that I would want to explore plants or fungi to help me. But they usually have an inner knowing and an inner calling that's like something else is possible. Mm-hmm. There are more options than what's being presented to me by a doctor. And for whatever reason, we don't consider those prescriptions to be drugs, even though things like ADHD medications and and benzodiazepines, SSRIs, all of these things are having like really intense impacts on our body and can create really intense withdrawal.
Yeah,
and that's not to say that plants don't also have that. They can also have that. That's a weird dichotomy we create where we're like, plants are super gentle and they have no side effects. And it's like, no. We want to see all these things in their fullness to be able to embrace the real complexity. It's a complex conversation.
Yeah, and especially to remember that like all those pharmaceuticals, like where do they come from other than plants? Like there's just such an interesting world that we talk about these things. And I think part of the reality is that we've created this medical model framework for the human experience in psychology, right? Where it's like, okay, you have an infection, here's your antibiotics, right? And now we're coming to into the space of like trying to do the same thing with human psychology. Oh, you have suffering, here's this, right? And like that's not really taking into context all of these larger pieces that need to be considered when it comes to the human experience, because the human psyche is not necessarily like a cut or a bruise. Like there's more complex pieces to it than just like slapping on an antibiotic towards that, right? And until we kind of like get that holistic model where all of our providers are able to have these conversations, then we're missing out on like important pieces of the healing process for people.
Yeah, so true. And something else, and again, like this is not to say that, well, I'll just say it. We talk about is grief and normal human emotions, like the spectrum of human emotion, and how we've in the medical model like increasingly pathologized grief. Like there used to be this gap of time where doctors wouldn't diagnose you or prescribe an antidepressant if you had like lost a parent or completely like been in an accident and completely lost your way of livelihood. These super intense experiences that we need to emote and we need to feel, that that timeline has like shortened and shortened and shortened so much so that now it's just like, okay, your dad died, but here's an antidepressant. And so that's a lot of what we find ourselves doing in class and even in consults, is like validating people's real human emotions. And feedback we've gotten is they're like, oh my goodness, like I needed this so much. And like my doctor never validated how I was feeling. It was always just like jumping to the diagnosis, to the prescription, and how important that is. And not to say, of course, like what I was going to say in the beginning was that, of course, that can like impact our ability to function. And if it goes on for a really long time and it's, impacting our relationships and our work, like, maybe we need some help, of course. Like, not to say that, but also that it's okay to feel sad.
Yes, exactly.
Pharmaceuticals can be
in this world we're living in this time and this culture, like there is so much uncertainty and grief collectively as well.
Which is what makes me sad too. Like, you come to me saying that you lost your mom or someone important in your world, and you come to a psychologist again, because if I go through the insurance model, I have to give a diagnosis. I have to diagnose you as having some sort of disorder to be able to receive services under that model, right? And so like I can have a conversation with clients about that so that it's less of that, just so that they're aware of that process. But it's also like, okay, so you're coming to me, 6 months after you're still, right? Don't like that word. You're upset, naturally, because you've lost someone important in your life, but I have to find some sort of diagnosis that is like, this is prolonged grief. Check, check, check. All right, here you go. I don't like that. And I think that's enacting more harm when we have to do things like that rather than hold space for the complexities. And then I think that even goes a step deeper when people are depressed, stressed, anxious. And I'm like, well, yeah, you're living under a capitalistic structure where you are getting paid minimum wage and you don't know if you can go into, at least in America, into the ER and get care for yourself without it costing thousands of dollars. So yeah, when you get, like me, get staph infection and you're on Medicaid because you're a student and you're like, where the fuck am I going to go? And you're stressed about that. That makes sense. We live in a very like world that's not currently built for all people to be thriving and happy. And so like I don't personally agree with diagnosing people at that point to be like, you have depression, when I would say the system's broken and you are suffering under that, right? Or you're grieving naturally like a human.
You're understandably upset.
I'm like, yeah, you're upset for the right reasons, and I'm with you. Like, Jesus, my God, you know? It's crazy.
Yeah. And so I kind of am curious, you know, because you are pursuing this route of licensure, Nicole, like, because I work in the birth world, yes, with coming into contact with registered midwives, same thing. Like, I know there's this goal of healing, and I know at some level they understand like their limitations. And I almost kind of wish, and you just said this, like, you talk to your clients about that. I don't see that necessarily being, I don't know, risky for you and your license to like just talk about how it works and explain, you know, like, so you're coming to me, this is the system I'm working under, I have to do a diagnosis. However, this is how I feel about that. And like, maybe we can work together to get you the, you know, the care that you need without putting so much weight on that diagnosis. So I don't know. I feel like maybe there's room there in some of these medical professions where there's room for some honesty and transparency about this, how it works and how the licensures work. You know, like for birth work, like I often think about this, you know, like, yes, registered midwives are required in Canada to like offer certain interventions in birth. Like they have this list and they have to like offer things. But what ends up happening is women often feel like coerced because they're asking and they've said no, and then they're asking again. And, you know, the intention maybe isn't coercion, but that's how it feels to the woman or the person birthing. So like, is there room to explain like, okay, you know, I have my little list and I'm going to have to do this. Remember, you still have choice. Like you feel into your experience of what's needed. And I'm just going to check off my boxes because I need to. You know, I just feel like there's more room for that.
There absolutely is. And that is how I've conducted every session that I've done therapy with where I'm currently training, because that's kind of the model where they said, like, open up the discussion, have it. So like first consultation or session I'm having with someone, it's literally like, okay, these are the symptoms. We have to play the game. What diagnosis feels accurate to you, and having that open conversation about that. And I think that would be a good message for any sort of clinicians that are listening to this podcast, to be able to like bring that conversation into the room, to take away the power over dynamic that typically looks at another person, diagnoses them and puts them down, to have it a collaborative conversation about, you know, this is what I see, this is what I have to do under the system. How does this feel for you? Because as someone on the other end who went through therapy and then got a diagnosis of like adjustment disorder, which is reflective of having prolonged difficulty in a time period, you know, longer than expected, aka you're struggling to adjust, right? And PTSD and other things. But like, how does that feel when you receive that? Oh, I'm not normal because I'm still grieving in the system, or I'm still like, something's wrong about me. And I think that causes more harm through that model of saying something's wrong about you when it's normal grief for the world that you're in.
Thank you for doing that in your practice. Like, I really do think that's something, you know, that can make a huge impact to build trust with clients. Like you said, the collaborative, like they're actually participating in their own well-being. I think that's super important. Yeah.
I think with diagnosing, you know, on the one hand, it can be helpful sometimes for people to have a word they can use to refer to themselves, to have a word they can Google or whatever to look up resources and stuff. And what does this feel like for you? Like, what does this show up as for you? Like, when you say you have anxiety, like, what are the sensations in your body? Like, what does that feel like for you, like mentally, emotionally, spiritually? I'm not even really sure mental health really exists. I think that it's a reflection of our whole self. So like not only ourself, like what our physical body is doing, because our physiology has a massive impact on our mental experience, but also like our spiritual world, our emotional world, the world that we live in socially and like globally, you know, and all of these things, right? It's like this idea that mental health can be represented by a little brain diagram is so disconnected from, it's not just our brain, like even just looking at the connection between our gut and our brain. It's really just kind of opening up this idea that we don't have to live in these boxes where we're like, I'm anxious and I'm this thing forever. It's like having the self-knowledge to be able to understand ourselves better. And I think when we can do that, we also have more empathy for others. We're able to really see other people with more complexity, and it makes our relationships healthier.
Right.
Lets us set boundaries in a better way because we understand ourselves and other people better.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said about there being a benefit to a label. I think when I was first diagnosed with anxiety, a couple of years ago, it was helpful to kind of normalize that, right, in that way. And so it allowed me, and I think some other people, compassion for yourself, because, you know, it's not my fault. There's other pieces here. This is normal. Well, it's normal that other people suffer with this. But yeah, the more I've studied psychology, the more I've realized, yeah, one, kind of what you're saying, which is like, we don't know how it's all connected, but it is definitely connected. We'll tell you that. And we still don't know how it all works. And that a lot of what our experience is relational, from my understanding, right? Relational in terms of like the relationships you have in your life, in terms of how you're connected to society and what society presents for you and all those sort of things. So like so much of what I experience as anxiety was taught through, you know, my family dynamics of people who had never been to therapy, never had any discussion of mental health, my mom who's a domestic violence survivor, like all of these pieces that she doesn't even realize and teaches me. And then I enact with all my other partners and relationships and friends who kind of teach me how to exist in this space, so much so that like it's not my fault for having anxiety, right? It's like it's a reality of being under the system. It's a reality of being in the context of the relationships I've had that taught me how to live and how to process my emotions. So it's like so much so that like, yes, we can have this diagnosis that's helpful to like give some sort of grounding in that experience, but also like it's never our fault in that sort of reality. And I think that's where I'm always writing that line of like helpful to have the diagnosis, and then also like the ways that like, at least from my own experience, I internalize that diagnosis to be like, I have anxiety. So getting off my SSRI was a scary game, because then I'm like, can I do it? What if I can't function off of this because I have anxiety and I'm crippled in this sort of way where I can't function without it? I've been fine thus far, but like that has been a journey to process.
It's a big journey. It's a really big journey that most of us are experiencing without anyone to really talk about it with us in depth.
Right.
Almost everyone that we talk to about it, it doesn't go that deep. And I think with SSRIs particularly, this has been my experience, and I've noticed from talking to clients and stuff like this that it tends to be shared. SSRIs in particular, I find, tend to allow you to function better in capitalism, tend to allow you to be easier for other people to be around, but they may not necessarily improve your internal experience of living on the planet. And, you know, that's, I believe we can do better than that. It's not to say that there isn't a place for SSRIs. I think that there can be, for sure. But I don't consider my mental well-being like I'm easier to be around and I show up at work on time. No, like that's not enough. There's got to be, it's got to go deeper than that, you know?
Yeah, and that, like you were saying, Nicole, like the word, the diagnosis can bring that sense of also community, right? Like connecting with other experiences. But then, yes, the internalization and the identifying, and that it's always going to be that way, that it's forever, that it's permanent. And I think that's also something missing within the medical model, is like checking in with people. Okay, you've been on this pharmaceutical for this long, you know, like things can change. Our circumstances can change. When it comes down to it, this diagnosis is really just describing, you know, different sensations and experiences we have in our bodies, which we have access to that information. And so we can know, you know, yeah, like maybe that might change. It's an experience, not an identity.
Right.
That's important to remember.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think there needs to be more conversation about that too, right? Like all of these pieces were really just, we're still living in the old ages in terms of like psychology, spirituality, and how all of these things come together. So I think conversations like these that are opening up more discussion, I think about the nuance and really just the big question mark we have with a lot of these things. Just remembering that we really don't know. If we can say anything, is we still don't know. And so like you guys have been talking about trusting your inner experience with these things and trusting the community that you can look to and connect with, because a lot of this is just still a really big question mark.
I think a lot of us will talk about, you know, how we're feeling in ways that make us uncomfortable. I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling depressed, I'm this, I'm that. And I'll often say to people, well, how do you want to feel? What is it that you want to be feeling? And then we know that certain tools can not necessarily produce those feelings, but that can maybe give us a different access. And I think, again, to loop back to what we talked about in the very beginning, like exercise, mindfulness, all these things can also do that. Yeah. But we're lucky that we also have tools, pharmaceuticals, herbal tools, spiritual tools, fungal tools, so many things that can let us like kind of get a little bit closer, like to feeling more joy or because the answer to that question is often interesting, right? It's like you get away from the idea of, I just don't want to feel anxious anymore. It's like, well, what is it that you do want to feel? And most often it's like, I want to feel more connected. I want to take the risk of feeling sadness so that I can feel more joy. I want to find my purpose. Like, these are not things that, you know, whatever supplements or tools or tinctures or whatever you're using, a tincture is not going to give you a sense of purpose.
Right. Right.
It's a deeper journey, right, of getting to know yourself. But I also think that a bigger toolbox is always better for helping people, like, you know, be able to take those steps to do that deep inner work that is ongoing forever. Like, I love having older friends in my life who are in their 60s or their 70s. And it's like, they can have that humility of like, it doesn't end, you know, we don't get to a point where we're like, the work is over.
Which is exciting and terrifying at the same time, right?
Yeah. Like Spirilic, right? It's like, I think it's kind of the same thing, but it's getting, you know, deeper or closer to God or whatever, whatever metaphor works for you.
Yeah, we'll be seeing what I'll be talking about on this show at 80 once I've had many of spirals in the psychology world, right? I'm sure it'll be very different. Yeah.
But also not, right? Like, I think in an essence way.
Yeah.
Essence will be the same, but the spiral will reveal all these different layers and pieces. And yeah, I think that's what we're trying to do with having this conversation, is like make room for people to have that spiral and that sense of reflection and that sense of community with other people, to understand that we're kind of all in it together. We're all in it together trying to figure this out.
Absolutely, absolutely. Frequently, psychologists think they're not a part of that game, and I'm here to say I am, and we all are. Like you're saying, we're all going through this struggle. We don't get to just put on that white coat or that degree and be like, yep, I don't struggle with that at all. So
I mean, I love that your willingness to be authentic and to not be so clinical, you know, not sort of protect your. I can understand why there is sort of a thought that that's maybe a more professional or boundaried or whatever the case may be, right? But I also think having transparency about our struggles, and because I think sometimes with us being herbalists, people can sometimes think like, you know, we have all this information and we're like these magical, mystical beings. And it's like, no.
I had one of the worst mental health spirals during our class.
Exactly.
It's like, I'm literally using all these tools right now to help me show up and be here in this moment.
I feel very blessed to get to have this conversation with people and to get to do it with Jaycee, because she's great.
Aww, so cute. Yeah, and I'm glad that you both have each other then to like be supports in this, you know, and to look to one another and to grow together and to be doing good work in the community and helping other people in their journeys. It's very powerful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, then as we come towards the end of our time, I usually hold a little bit of space in case there was anything that you really wanted to say that we didn't get to. Otherwise, I have a closing question that I can ask both of you.
I'm ready. I'm ready to close.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, then the question I ask everyone on the podcast, and you can both answer, is what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
I think probably a longing to be seen, and also a total terror and fear of that exact same thing.
We call that vulnerability, and it is uncomfortable.
Yeah, and the craving of the intimacy that comes from that vulnerability, right? And I'm definitely processing something in my life like that right now, where it's just like, it's like so beautiful, but so terrifying. It's so blah, you know. It's a lot, but I think it's also like it's the core thing of the human experience.
Yes, it means you're alive. It means you're living when you're starting to dream enough that you feel that fear, and to connect enough that you feel that fear and that.
Yeah. One thing I wish people knew was more normal, that no one has it figured out.
Yeah.
No one has it figured out. This is what we signed up for, you know, as part of the human experience, was all of it. All of it.
Yep, both sides of the coin. We get the joy with the pain, and we figure it out each day, and we all have to figure it out in our own way, because there is no right or wrong way to live in this existential void. And so like finding that out for all of us is a journey and a half. So yeah, anyone who's
okay to need to be reminded of that every single day.
Yes. Yes. So whether that's affirmations from your community, a post-it note you look at every day in the mirror, like that doesn't make you weak. That's part of the human experience, is figuring this out every single day. Yeah. Well, it was lovely to have both of you and get to have this conversation. Is there anywhere you'd want to plug for the work that you're doing so people can find you and connect with you?
We have a link that is going to be an ongoing link that we use to get people to sign up for getting updates on the next round of the class. So we'll give you the link so that people can share their emails with us.
Awesome. I'll have all of that linked below so people can find you, and then
I'll give you a link to my contraception book.
Yes, I do. I do need that after today's conversation. If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're a part of the anarchist community, then follow us on Instagram or nominate a guest for the show by sending in a letter to modernanarchypodcast@gmail.com. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.